All right, so thank you again for joining us with Father Steve for Othering Conversations on Bias and Microaggressions. It's so wonderful to have all of you here. Father Steve, we are so pleased to have you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back in the mix.
When you're ready.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, really, this is a wonderful opportunity for a reunion. And the way in which this reunion will continue forward and what we will learn, I hope that this is just the first of many occasions that we might be able to get together and talk about things and just also reconnect. It's great to see so many faces of the people who were a huge part of my time in Columbus, my wonderful time in Columbus. So thank you so much for being a part of this. And let's begin as we always do with a prayer. In the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks and praise for this opportunity to come together as people of one faith to look at how we might be more open to more of your people. Help us to look at those things on the inside of us or the systems in which we find ourselves to see where doors have been closed. And with the grace that you continually give upon us, with the ways in which your Holy Spirit has enlivened and encouraged us through great giftedness. Help us to open those doors so that the least of our brothers and sisters may understand themselves as being great. We ask these things as we ask all things through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
So, as Karen mentioned before, I'm going to invite everyone to please mute themselves. In the lower left-hand corner, you will see a microphone,
Yeah.
and just click it and make sure that there's a red strike over the mic. There we go. And I'm going to share my screen so that we might be able to be on one accord here. And we shall begin with this conversation about othering. Now, obviously, with this being the day where we commemorate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it's a time for us to really look at how we are being very open to everyone, and if there is in any way that we are causing or perpetrating in any conscious or any unconscious way a division and a divisiveness. Lord knows we don't need any more of that after we see what's going on in our government today and also locally around us with the us and the them and the ways in which through social issues and all sorts of things that we have to contend with on a daily. We don't need any more divisiveness and we don't need any more divisions. And so this becomes an opportunity for us to become aware of what's in us. So how do we begin to make decisions? How do we draw conclusions? How do we begin to really negotiate the way in which we will relate to the people that are right in front of us? And coming off, or not even coming off, but hopefully one day when Cootie Rona is a history and we read about it in some book, we will really need to figure out how we will be with one another. And in so doing, this becomes a great opportunity in light of so many things coming to the forefront. A chance for us to see how we are inviting the other to be the part of us. So when we look at othering, and when I do any kind of education around othering, the first thing that I'd like to do is not so much concentrate on the object of the othering, if you will, but rather on us. We need to take a look at ourselves, to look in the mirror, make sure our houses are in order, because that's going to spell our level of capability and desire to really make room and make space for all of our brothers and sisters. Or we can also get a sense of how much space we've actually made. So by doing that, we're going to do a couple of things. The first is, there we go, here we go. Oh, I should welcome and thank everybody for doing this. I think I've already done that. Welcome, everyone, and thank you. Thank you. So tonight, we're going to look at a couple of things. First, we're going to take a look at 4 forms of bias. Now, these are the influences that are going to help us to process this information, all of these sense data that we get when we encounter someone, that sense data that has been articulated by all these different outside influences, but we have actually made room for them in our heads and in our hearts in the ways in which we might relate to another, how we draw those conclusions, and thus how we're going to fuel those motivations. Take a look at those 4 forms. Now, if anybody has done any kind of study on biases, they'll know that they're not just 4. There are about 400. I have chosen these 4 because I think that they are, when we look at the future, particularly after the last couple of weeks, these are the 4 that are going to make a huge difference in the way that we begin to process the information and really figure out how we're going to come together, particularly after such strife, and in looking at our future days with a new administration and all of the ramifications that go along with that. Then we're going to take a look at 3 microaggressions. These are ways in which the ways in which the biases that are within us and the ways in which we have kind of resolved ourselves to work or to be with others. These are some of the ways in which they may be expressed. And we're going to take a look at microaggressions and some of the dubiousness around that. I'm going to ask us to be very, very open to the experience of this, first from the receiver and then from the giver. So we may also always have good intentions about some of the things that we may say or do, but the question is, how are they received? And to really look at that from a contextualized point of view. And so we'll get into that a bit more. And then finally, we're going to take a look at how people of faith can use their tenets of faith to make personal, communal, systematic changes. So these changes will start locally, but will have global implications. And also to really look at how we can be more forward and more intentional about our works of justice, acceptance, equity, and respect. Because these are going to be the key words for the ways in which we create our little piece of the country going forward here in America. All right, so the 4 forms of bias that we're going to look at: implicit bias, confirmation bias, affinity bias, and framing bias. It's important to realize that these are not separate, but they're actually kind of formed as a Venn diagram. They don't necessarily build upon one another, but they do influence one another. And the circles, when they do cross, create, if you will, the ways in which we have kind of agreed to the way that we comprehend things. And so when we kind of look at how to identify and then, if necessary or when necessary, unlearn the effects of these biases and then relearn the right way, just remember that sometimes these things overlap. The other thing I want us to keep in mind is that the work that we have ahead of us when these biases are indeed identified is a long, long road. So the very first thing I have to ask everybody to remember, even as you find yourself in any of these categories or you find an action that resembles something that you may have said and you may have done or you may have thought, be gentle with yourselves. Mercy, 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 okay? We're all here to learn. If you didn't care, you wouldn't have signed up. So let's count that as a plus in the mercy counter. Say, I want to love, and this is an opportunity to really figure out how to do that. So be gentle with yourself. Secondly, be patient. It's just going to take some time to do this unlearning, to do the investigations necessary and the work necessary to really see the world and see the people of the world in a different light. We've been very, very, very well educated in the way that we currently see the world now. So it's going to take a lot of time for us to relearn something differently. So let's look at implicit bias. Implicit bias, as I've written, it's also known as unconscious bias. It refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. That word unconscious is the key word. Unlike explicit bias, which is overtly expressed, implicit bias operates indirectly. So it's almost something that we don't necessarily or conscientiously decide to do, but it is something that organically happens based on the ways in which we have either processed or put together the stuff that we have taken in. It's also done with a bit of vagueness. We may have the best of intentions sometimes, again, but because things may be either partially processed or need more of an input from folks. There can be a bit of a vagueness with that, and I'll give you some examples of the vagueness as well. And oftentimes these biases are taken in and processed without full awareness. So let me give you some examples of explicit and implicit bias. So back in the Jim Crow North, we used to always see these signs, particularly in times of white flight, from one neighborhood into another. Uh, we would we would see signs about white communities only. We want white tenants in our white community, and so these signs were always put up to show very explicitly that there was a racial preference for that particular community, and also that there was racial exclusion going on. Now, we don't see these things as blatantly as we did once before in the history of our country, but the experience of the racial preference still exists. And it exists through actions of implicit bias. And so the cartoon on the right shows us how this might happen. She told me I could fill out a card, but she couldn't show me a unit. Now, this is a great example of the vagueness. Some may say, well, maybe there was another factor involved. Maybe the woman was busy, or there was something else that led the person to believe that there was a lack of qualification that was there, and so that goes into the whole vagueness of things. But the general meaning of it comes out in the conclusiveness, and particularly when these things are quantified. So when you have for example, I'll just use some stats that we have here in California. When in certain communities you find that it is 64% more likely for a white person to receive better treatment and not have to go through all these background checks in order to get this particular apartment, then you see a great example of implicit bias in action. And such is the experience of such folks, as being said by this woman who is in the cartoon here. You know, was showing me around the units. He was like, this one faces south. You'd have a good amount of room here. You know, we welcome you into the space. So to look at the ways in which implicit bias really hits home is more around the behaviors, the systematic policies, some of the rules and regulations that are associated with the situation. These are the ways in which implicit bias actually show themselves, or show itself, sorry. Here are some truths about implicit bias. First of all, it is very pervasive. As we have seen in this country, there's a sharp division amongst the races that has been going on for a very, very long time and continues. It really does. I'm not going to say vindication, but I'll say that it makes me feel good to know that so many more people see the divisions in this country that I have always seen as a Black man in this country for 52 years. That we have indeed done some progression, but we still have a long way to go. If anyone is interested in listening to something pretty prophetic Martin Luther King on April, I think it was April 17th of 1967, gave a speech at Stanford University called The Other America. It is a great speech to look up and to listen to. It's about 45 minutes where he talks about two Americas. One America is for, is a land of liberty and prosperity for some, but for others, it is a land of destitution and poverty and oppression. And to look at how he really talks about both of those uh, in a language that seem using examples rather that seem to be very much um, that are very much the case even today. So take a look, take a listen to that. So implicit bias is very pervasive, but it is also malleable. It's not a permanent, and it can change with great thought, with better insight, with better experiences, with a better understanding of another. There are ways in which implicit bias can indeed be changed. And then they reinforce one another. So biases about people can indeed those biases, implicit biases, can actually build upon one another. Let me give you an example of how that might happen. So so I'm a great example of this. First, I'm black, I'm a man, and I'm also big. I'm no small thing. And so for those that have issues about Black people of a certain size, or Black men, or men of a certain size, then all of those kind of go into this conglomerate of a conflated bias that does not make me at all approvable to anyone who might encounter me. So that's why they might reinforce one another. Now, here's the interesting thing about implicit bias, that they may not align with conscious values or professed beliefs. It's important to understand again that these biases are unconscious, which means they come from a place that is indeed authentic within us, but not one that we think about pretty regularly. Now, that being the case, we really do need to look at the source of these biases. And I put some at the bottom there in terms of the outside influences. I want to talk a bit also about how they stick, how these biases stick. So when we look at things such as fear, such as pains or wounds that are not healed, experiences of the past that have been pretty traumatic, all of those things create conduits for implicit or unconscious biases to take hold, in our minds. And then sometimes these things are triggered and they just bring up much more reasons for us to abide by those biases. They can indeed be easily learned. And what I mean by that is that they can, and passed along. What I mean by that is that they can be easily passed from one trusted figure to another, or a figure who is at the disposal of that person. So when parents hold a particular unconscious or implicit or explicit bias, then we can almost be assured that the child who doesn't have an influence that would give them some sort of a challenge, I need to make that very clear, will probably hold on to that bias as well. I've heard of situations of children who came from families that were extremely anti-Black, or let's put it in the other way, they were extremely anti-white, and had children that were raised in with that kind of vocabulary and discussion always going on, examples constantly being given about how bad that particular group of people, whoever they may be, is. And yet the child comes out not abiding by that same bias because they've had an influence. Usually it could be a friend of that hated group, or it could be a source of education that they may have received from school or from their peer group that leads them to, or church. Hey, how about that as a great factor to lead them to think about things in a completely different way. And so there are many, many cases in which those who had once listened to trusted figures on these matters do not necessarily abide by the same biases. So some sources, some outside sources for implicit bias. I talked about some of the inside ones, but the outer sources about upbringing, family of origin issues, where you look at the culture in the home, particularly what was that like, and what did that impress upon us as we decided to make our own spaces. Our education, based on the ways in which education was actually presented and what was presented, has some influence on these biases. Cultural influences, obviously, the in groups in which we find ourselves will have great influence about the way in which we see the world. Social groups, uh, usually by the same manner as cultural influences. And then media, what is it that we're listening to and feeding ourselves on a regular? Okay. So knowing your implicit bias is half the battle here. So look at what determines your sense of right and wrong. You know, can you? And I always say, if you can take a list of the top three things that come to mind for each of these, this will tell you where your biases may lie. So what determines your sense of right and wrong? What determines your idea of what is beautiful and what is ugly? What helps you to estimate your level of safety and well-being? How do you begin to, what helps you to form your opinions and impressions of others? And what helps you to draw your conclusions about actions and motivations? Look at the top three, just the top three, and see what they may be, just to give yourself a sense of that. Okay, confirmation bias. I know I'm probably going to speed along here. I'm more than happy to share my slides. So if anybody is ever interested in receiving them, just let Karen know. I'll send Karen a copy. And yeah. So confirmation bias is a tendency to search for, interpret, and favor and recall information that confirms and supports one's prior belief or values. The best way to really understand confirmation is to see it in action, y'all. Here it is. So it is, no matter what that person says, no matter what they do, I already have my sense of who they are and what they're capable of, and my whole determination of how I see them and how I will respond to them and how I will treat and regard them is already made up and has no bearing on any objective facts or any objective behaviors or any stories about why this person did what they did that is being shared with me. I've already made up my mind. So these are two wonderful cartoons to help you determine, to help you see confirmation bias in action. The reason why confirmation bias reigns as pretty important in these days is because we're in an era where it has become easy to dismiss someone on just a snapshot or a portion of their truth. So just a partiality of their truth that someone takes, and either if it's criminal activity or criminalized, then that colors the whole person. That colors the whole person, and there is no room for looking at that action in any kind of context. Secondly, that if that little sliver is labeled as egregious enough in whoever's opinion, then that person is completely dehumanized and dismissed. I want to talk about just some reasons for confirmation behavior, how this has come up. A lot of these reasons have been given from observation, my own observations, as well as some of those of us, of social psychologists and sociologists mainly. So their reasons for confirmation bias is for professional, personal benefit, you know, just so they would get whatever it is that they want. Also, the need to be right, which is a big one. I wanted to put that first, but I thought I'd be kind. the need to be right or to be the best or to be the winner is one of the reasons for confirmation bias. The fear of the unknown. So fear that I don't know what's actually happening, or fear I don't know if I will be able to adapt to the change that is being brought before me. I might feel that I'm too old or too comfortable or too whatever to change, or the fear of being in error. What will that bring against me? And so I need to be able to stick to something that's going to show me is right so that the ramifications of my wrong I won't experience. That's a great defense mechanism for that same kind of reason. And then big old E, egoism. Pride is one of the big reasons for a confirmation bias. One of the things to understand about a confirmation bias is that the side effect is a wonderful, wonderful light show of pride and adulation for the person who holds it, particularly if they find themselves in their in group sharing that same confirmation bias. Okay, here are some ramifications of confirmation bias. Nothing like this doesn't come with any really adverse effects. And so it does hinder our ability to critically think, and it does hinder, and it also makes some not credible our curiosity. It completely takes our credibility of curiosity away. So we don't feel the need to do any research or any companioning because I already know what I need to know. Secondly, dismisses stories from others' point of view and closes off the possibility of diverse viewpoints. In fact, it shuts them down by showing that diverse viewpoints are either less than or even more dangerous than the viewpoint held by the person who is showing off that confirmation bias. Finally, it diminishes personhood. Now, here's something that is really, really insidious. It diminishes personhood because it only looks at the person based on that bias. And so the only thing that I see is what my beliefs have led me to label you as. There is within that a dehumanizing characteristic of it because it's using a strategy called classification. And classification is step one that leads towards uh, ethnic cleansing and genocide. I don't necessarily want to take everything to that particular end, but just to say that when we as a human species, as a group of civilizations, have ever used classification as a general strategy in which we put people, the results have never once been positive. Never once been positive. So taking away a person's human and slapping a label upon them, which is exactly what confirmation bias allows us to do, becomes the surefire way of us going down a very, very dangerous road. All right, affinity bias, the unconscious tendency to show preference for those who are like us. And this bias shows up in any form where the acceptance is guided by a fostered culture. So this is the time when we want to make sure that the people who are like us are the only ones who are with us. In this world today particularly in the West, particularly, but not exclusively, it is very easy for us to create our own, I like to call them aquariums. It's a place where we can have our own news, our own people, our own resources, the things that we like to and are comfortable to be around are the only things that we surround ourselves with. And so when this takes on more of an exclusionary property, then it just kind of runs right into our notions of tribalism. But we've created our own world and we can do that. How many of us remember when, I'm gonna see if I can increase this just a little bit here. How many of us remember when there were only 3 or 4 news channels on TV? Raise your hand. Yes. And remember when those news channels, although some of them may have had a particular kind of bias, there was at least a sense of the other side. You know, it wasn't in all cases balanced, but at least we got news from both sides of the issue. Well, nowadays, we can't quite count the number of news agencies that are there. And so we can subscribe to any kind of news agency. Also, you know, before social media hit the scene, we also had to talk to one another and we had to be in each other's spaces. There was, before the advent of social media, sociologists are blaming this all on social media. I think that there's more, just a little more to it, but I see their point. When social media was created, it got rid of what was known as the third space. And that was the place where you go that wasn't home and it wasn't work, and it got you out in public. It was the place where you communed with your people, but you weren't always the only one there. So think of the bowling alley. The bowling alley, we've got our lane, we've got our team that's on our lane, but we can't choose who's on the lane that's next to us. And so inevitably, we're going to have an encounter with the other, whoever the other might be. And because there is a similarity in what we are doing, there's obviously a love for bowling in the bowling alley. Why else would you be there? Except the nachos. The nachos were worth going to a bowling alley for too. But we're all there. It becomes an opportunity for us to reach out beyond the social borders that we will find outside of the bowling alley and create a path for understanding the other in that respect. Well, the third space is rapidly disappearing. It's all but gone because now we can get on Facebook, we can create our groups, we can Zoom or video conference with all the people that we like, and everything is tailored to our own specifications and preferences. And so this strengthens affinity bias because now we have a culture in which we know we can work very well in because we're never challenged and we're never given the opportunity to really foster those parts of ourselves that can open up to the other. And so because of that, we continue to carry this culture that we fostered through affinity bias into every aspect of our lives, most notably the workplace. So I put 2 examples up here showing us what affinity bias is. If you look on this one on the right with the delicious gummy bears, how dare they not accept green apple when that's the best flavor in a gummy bear bag? But such it was, sisters and brothers. The cherries, the lemons, and the oranges got together because they saw a commonality in them, and they excluded the delicious green apple. And these are the sorts of things that we might actually see in some of the groups and arenas that we find ourselves in. Also looking here on the next one where we hear Mr. Dinsdale is approved by these gentlemen because there's a common look. There is a sense that that everybody is going to fit in if you begin to assimilate, if you will, with the main culture, with the dominant culture that is there. I want to talk about, however, just a couple of things about affinity bias that brings up a bit of conundrums. Just because we do have the ability to create our own worlds and our own sense of what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable with greater ease in our lives today, it still brings up a couple of conundrums that do need to be discussed. So there is a notion of fit. When we do create our social groups and put ourselves out there, there are people that will naturally fit in and there are those that won't fit in. And so how do we begin to draw the line between fit, whether or not this person actually fits in, or tribalism, which means that there is only going to be folks like us with no room made for anybody that might challenge us with an idea, that might give us a sense of an energy that is foreign to us, or something that is awkward or uncomfortable for us. How do we actually draw the line between the two of those? Second one is tokenism versus diversity equity. So how do we know if we're accepting somebody just to look like we are diverse, a la tokenism, or are we going to accept them with the idea of changing the way that we completely do things so that we might be more amenable and open and accepted by to a greater variety of people? And then there's progression versus cultural integrity, which is another big one. How do we maintain a sense of really thinking about the signs of the time for the day while also holding on, or, while also holding on to what makes us unique and relevant and has lasted the test of time, without becoming, again, stagnant. We're not becoming actually stagnant within our own cultural identity. So just some conundrums to really think about as we begin to deal with this affinity bias. All right. I'm rushing along because we should already be in our first group talk, but this is the last one, and then we'll move in there. So, framing bias, also known as the framing effect for all you psychologists out there. It refers to the influence which bases decisions and conclusions on the manner in which data is presented. So we look at the wording, we look at the setting. What does the photo or the representation actually look like? We look at the situation there. We look at the people who are involved. What are all these factors actually saying to us? And to look at the way in which it's presented versus the facts themselves. And framing bias is something that is used very, very almost ubiquitously in our world today. So I want to start with the cartoon on the right here before I go to the pictures of OJ. So the cartoon on the right shows two hamburgers. One is advertised as 75% fat-free, and you see the huge line behind that. Well, what's also true about that burger that they don't advertise is that it's 25% fat. And so when we look at those as both truths, the way in which the one truth or partial truth is presented is much more effective than the other one. So that's one way. But when we look at the two magazine covers that were highlighting the very famous J Simpson trial, for all you young bloods out there, go back. YouTube has a lot on that. I think there have been some movies since then, so I don't think anybody should be out of the loop on this. But this was one of the more publicized way that framing bias got into, I would say, just kind of the world of media ethics, and particularly how we were receiving our information. So if we look at the way Newsweek showed OJ's arrest picture, that was the actual picture itself. But then Time darkened it, making it look much more sinister and much more foreboding. And if memory serves, that Time magazine actually sold more copies than Newsweek did of the same issue. I mean, of the same article or subject matter rather. And so to really look at how it is that information is being presented to us and how we are influenced by that manner, by that framing. Just to talk about a couple of effects for framing bias. Much of the work that I have done and using framing bias has been in ethics. But when we look at our news, particularly our news, also the way that some people, I'm trying to be as diplomatic as I can, and it's just not working, y'all. So I'm just going to have to put it out there. Some political figures actually say some things that they say, uh, and considering the wording that they use, particularly when it's violent and when it is very degrading and denouncing another, just the kind of language and the kind of framing that is used to do that kind of denouncement is is very manipulative. So to help us to really look at the effects of framing, there are just certain things that I want to bring to your attention. The very first is it can be used as an aid of achieving objectivity and and simplification. So the example of using framing bias for objectivity, I'd like to share with you, comes from spiritual direction. So when a person comes to me and they say that they see this one event in their life, and they use that one event as a message from God for them to do something, my role as a spiritual director is to maybe help them frame it a little better using objectivity. Let's pull out a little. Let's look at this in a context versus in and of itself, and let's see if it still holds muster. Does God usually speak to you this way? Have you had this experience ever before where you have perhaps interpreted this as a message from God, and maybe upon further investigation, it became a message from your own anger, or whatever it was? So really just kind of reframing it by looking at it in a more objective light. But also it can be used to simplify, and I've seen this used a lot in a very positive way, I must say, in medical situations. And so when I was the chaplain during my CPE of the emergency room, time is of the essence, and many people who are coming in there don't have the luxury of completely reading a form before they have to sign it. And signing the form gives the doctors permission to operate. And so it's very, very simple when you say, listen, here is the gist of what this is. Now, it's not the whole story. It's not the whole story. And remember, framing bias is very good at just picking and choosing what is presented and lining that up in a particular way for you to answer in one particular way or another. But when it's very clear that something needs to happen and they don't have time to read everything that needs to be read, they don't have time to really sit back and look at all the pros and the cons, then framing bias can be used to simplify that whole process. Now, in another way, as I also mentioned, it conceals, it manipulates, it compels, and it directs. So to really be aware of what the intentionality of that framing bias is. It's used in education, marketing, media presentations, and other influential areas, that where we ever go for information, where we go for any sort of knowledge or any information for reasoning, this is where framing bias is often used. And here's the remedy to framing bias. Two things. One comes from my grandmother, one comes from my grandfather. My grandmother used to always say, "Sweetie pie, there's always more to the story." There's always more to the story. So get several stories before making a decision on things. And my grandfather used to say, "Do not jump on the bandwagon until you know who's driving." So figure out who it is that is giving this information to you and what their intentions are. All right. So let's do some talking. After hearing about these four biases, what initial thoughts or questions come to mind? I'm scratching the surface and I'm going at a rapid pace in doing so for things that are very, very huge. And if anyone is ever interested, I can certainly point to more resources to find out more information on any of these. I would just simply say Google it, but there are some really good sources. So why don't we break out into rooms and just have a conversation? What comes to mind, just initially, what comes to mind? questions or thoughts, and then we'll come back together and say, could we just say 10 minutes? Is that enough time for everybody?
That sounds great, Father Steve.
Okay.
All right, friends, you should be invited to your breakout room just now.